Hello BookTube, my name is Carrie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my March wrap-up. So to start off, I'm going to go over my March stats. So first off, I read 7 books in the month of March. 1 was a horror novella, 1 was a poetry collection, 2 were YA dystopian, with one of those being a novella. 1 was nonfiction, which was a socio-political nonfiction. 1 was contemporary fiction, and 1 was a middle grade historical fiction. So yeah, I read from quite a few genres this month. And the format that I read these in this month, 3 were audiobooks, which is 43% of my total monthly reading, and 4 were physical books, which was 57% of my monthly reading. And my average for the month was a 4.28 stars. So that's a pretty good average for the month. I am pretty pleased with that. So now that I've covered my stats, let's get into the actual books that I read. So to start off the month, I read The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle with a narration by Kevin R. Free. So this is a horror novella that is about a man named Charles Thomas Tester who gets involved in some dealings with both magic and the police after delivering this suspicious book to a known occult woman who the police have kind of been tracking, and things start to quickly unravel from there. I picked this up after seeing Katrina from Katrina Reads, who I will link down below, talk about this both in one of her wrap-ups and also on her Bookstagram, and I am so glad that I picked this up because this is one that was definitely outside of my comfort zone, but it was so good. It was such an interesting story. The writing was great. It made me not want to put it down, and the narrator was really good. I believe that it's actually a kind of reimagining of an H.P. Lovecraft story, but I had no background of that. I have not read any Lovecraft, but I still understood it and enjoyed it. So you don't necessarily need to have that context, I think. This is a book that I believe falls into the social horror subgenre because for me, some of the spookiest things about this book were the things that weren't even the supernatural elements to it. My only real issue with this is that I do wish it was a little bit longer just to flesh out a little bit more of the details a bit more. However, still a really good read. I rated it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Fouhey by Danez Smith. This is a poetry collection that is focused around themes of friendships, relationships, and community. And I read this one at a much slower pace than I usually read poetry. I do have an issue where I tend to fly through poetry all in one sitting instead of really letting it sit with me. With this one, I definitely broke it down a bit more, and I am thankful for that because I think the poems packed an even bigger punch. And it also really made me reflect on a lot of my own friendships and relationships. This collection really solidified for me that I love Danez Smith's writing style, or I guess poetry style would be a better way to put it. The way that they deconstruct heavy themes, but also make these poems so emotive. Truly, they are such a talented poet, and I want to read everything they've ever written. This read for me felt, I don't really know if refreshing is the right word, but cleansing kind of feels like a better one, in the sense that these are poems that are played around with a lot. There's a lot of experimentations with style, with structure, and these experimentations hold so much mixed emotion that really reflects the complexities of friendships and relationships that are explored in these poems and that feel very authentic to relationships and friendships that I think everyone has had. Something about that really connected well for me, and yeah, I just loved this collection, and I cannot wait to read literally anything and everything that they put out after this. 5 out of 5 stars, definitely in my favorites. Next, I read Shatter Me by Tahereh Mafi. This is a YA dystopian that came out maybe a decade ago. I have recently been seeing it all over my Bookstagram. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot. It's been years since I've read anything in that genre. Maybe I'll enjoy it, or maybe I'll be like, why did I ever read anything in this genre? And I was pleasantly surprised. I actually really enjoyed this. Just so much to the fact that I could not put it down the night that I started it. I finished it. I flew through it. Some background to this is that this is a YA dystopian about a girl who her touch can harm or kill people. So she was imprisoned after this crime was committed, and then is being conditionally released if she works with this revolutionary government that completely upturned her society. In the process of this, she meets this man, Adam, who she thinks she knows from before all of this, Adam is somehow immune to her touch. And so this changes everything for Juliet. I will say that in the beginning, this definitely had a slower start to it. But like I said, the pacing picked up relatively quickly. It was a book that I flew through once I was invested. I wasn't a big fan of the strike-through writing style that is kind of played around with in this first book, but I will say that I did like the writing overall. I think that the author had a knack for really building up tension and emotion in some of these scenes. Also, there were certain passages that felt almost poetic in a sense. So the writing was good for me. I think that this is going to be interesting to see how her writing develops throughout this series, because there are 6 books in this series, as well as I think 3 or 4 novellas. I will say that there wasn't a ton of character development in this first one. However, again, it's the first in the series, so I try not to judge it too harshly because I'm sure that will happen in the later books. I ended up giving this first one a 4 to 5 stars. Then I listened to the first novella, which is Destroy Me, which also by Tahereh Mafi, narrated by James Fouhey. This is a novella written from Warner's perspective, who is a character in the first book. And this was a game changer for me. This really changed my perspective of this character. And also it gave me what I was kind of missing from Shatter Me, and that I can see that she's definitely doing that character development of other characters, just incorporating it more in later books throughout the series. So I am looking forward to continuing the series after this, because this definitely gave me what I wanted. Yeah, I ended up giving this one a 4 to 5 stars. Next, I read You Sound Like a White Girl by Julissa Arce. And this is a nonfiction collection of essays that is interweaving local and federal discriminatory policies and laws, as well as the author's own experience being an undocumented immigrant in the United States, and a kind of cultural commentary on Latinx culture and Latinx American culture. And the way that these are all interwoven through the story works so well. I think that it provides so much context for what the author is arguing in each of her sections. The overarching theme of this is that assimilation should not be the goal of immigrants to the United States, because it plays into ideas of white supremacy. I definitely agree with that. As someone who works in ESL education, I really love this book. There's this one chapter especially called The Lie of English, and I think that she really highlights a lot of the issues in ESL education with some teachers not exactly valuing their students' native languages or cultures, not bridging cross-cultural gaps, or being understanding of the challenges that their students face outside of the classroom as well as inside of it. I am really thankful that something like this exists, because not only was this a very educational book for me in terms of Latin American culture and history, but also in terms of understanding some of the identity issues that some of my own students might face. I just think that this was an excellent book in deconstructing xenophobia and discrimination against Latinx people, and also encouraging others to be conscious of how history and culture shape identity and how those things are eroded by assimilation. A lot of people argue that assimilation means not having to get rid of your culture or language, but that's actually acculturation. It's a completely different concept, and I think that a lot of people don't realize that sometimes, and it's very difficult to explain to people that assimilation is abandoning one for the other. Acculturation is kind of negotiating the two together. And I really enjoyed this one, so much to the point that I'm actually using it in some research I'm doing for my master's. And I honestly hope that this is a book that gets taught in schools one day, because I think that it is that resourceful. If you couldn't tell, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, definitely on my favorites. Then I read Intimacies by Kitamura, which I have a lot of complicated feelings on. So this is a character study of an unnamed narrator who has these very complicated relationships. To me, there's no real sense of agency or connection or grounding to her life. It very much feels like she is very passive, kind of like a silent observer in her own life. I found this book slightly unsettling. I don't know if it was because this is an unnamed narrator or because there are a lot of these intense moral and ethical discussions in this book that are both like at a macro and a micro level disturbing. I had a lot of difficulty choosing a rating for this because on the one hand, I loved the detail in this story, and there's a lot of nuance to these discussions that are being had, especially the ones on language, which I found very interesting. There's a lot to do with translation and language in this that is a very niche read for me personally. However, I still really struggle to feel connected to the story itself. None of the characters are really likable, and there's not really any character development that took place. In fact, there's this one scene where you think that the character is going to make this decision, where she's going to finally take control of her life, and instead she like regresses back and doesn't do it. I guess in a sense you could argue that real people don't just make life-altering decisions like that, and that would almost be too happy of an ending for that storyline, which I can see. But also there's that issue of nothing really happened in this book, nothing substantial. And while I do think that these explorations of these very complicated relationships, these very problematic relationships, was interesting, there just wasn't anything really happening in this then. And I think also the way that it's written, even the reader is kept at a distance. We get these very insightful moments into the intimacies and examinations on life and language, but we don't really get to know this main character. We only get to know about her job and these relationships that she's in, whether those be friendships or romantic partners. But those never feel like a part of her. They feel like circumstances she's put in, not necessarily something she actively partakes in. So for me, I just felt like we were so distanced from the narrator that I didn't understand the point of those insightful moments if we still never really get to know her. And I'm left really wondering, what was I supposed to take away from this? This might be a book where I need to reread it to dissect it a little bit more in the future, but also nothing is really pulling me back in to want to reread it. So yeah, I enjoyed it, but it also gave me a lot of frustration. So I think my original rating was 4 stars. I might drop that down to a 3 now that I've thought about it a little bit more. The last book that I read in April was 90 Miles to Havana by Enrique Flores-Galbis, and this was narrated by the author. This is the story of a young boy who is coming of age during the outset of the Cuban Revolution, and he is forced to leave his parents behind and go with his brothers to America. I don't read a lot of historical fiction, so I was actually not sure how I was going to feel about this. I have no context for the Cuban Revolution, and also I just don't read a lot of middle grade, so I wasn't sure how I would feel about that. In retrospect, I'm actually glad that I did read this at middle grade, because there was a lot of context provided to this story that was easily digestible. And I was really pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this story. I, like I said, had no background on the Cuban Revolution, but I feel like this explains it in a way that is appropriate and accessible for younger readers without being too graphic or getting into like the intricacies of what all caused it. Also, it does deal with some heavy topics, but again, I felt like it was age appropriate and also handled in a way that kids would relate to those circumstances, in a sense of like understanding how it feels based on the character's explanations of this. Yeah, I really loved our main character, Julian. He was so sweet, and his love for his family and his dedication to his friends was amazing. His growth over the story was great. I loved seeing him really come into his own. I also just really liked the writing in this. I felt like it was really well paced, and for a middle grade novel, the characters still felt very well rounded. The story was well crafted. Yeah, it was a really good book. I actually just randomly found this on Audible and was like, I'll give it a whirl, and was very pleasantly surprised. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. So those are all the books that I read in March. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading. Bye.